This is Criteria.
Dude, I'm sorry that when we tried to record this a couple days ago, I didn't press the record button, nor did I even turn on the recording device for the first the first 20 minutes.
Well, I think it's appropriate. We're here talking about Dekalog 2, and for us, this is, in fact, take 2.
Right.
Our second time beginning this conversation.
Yeah.
I say beginning because we didn't really get that far into the conversation before we realized that we were not, in fact, recording it.
Yeah, thankfully. Yeah.
But we've waited a couple of days, we've regrouped, and here we are. Change of location, too. You're at my apartment this time.
That I am.
And let's talk about this film.
Dude, I saw this guy on the train today.
Okay, let's not talk about this film yet.
That was really unsettling. She was this dude. The first thing I saw when I came down the stairs into the subway is him. He had some kind of it looked like it might be like a woman's blouse or like some kind of cardigan or something that he was throwing around. Like he would throw it onto the platform and then pick it up and throw it on another place on the platform. And he had like a bag that he was carrying around, and he finally stuffed it in the bag and walked over to the other end of the platform. I noticed that he had a crowbar, which was when I started getting really nervous. He had a crowbar that he kept clanking on the ground as he walked.
Whoa.
And then I noticed him on further down the platform throwing punches into the air and sidestepping and stuff. I want to run up to this guy and take the crowbar and throw it onto the tracks, because I just don't want this guy to have that crowbar.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know what was wrong with him, but so today we're here to talk about the second part of Krzysztof Kieślowski's 10-part film series Dekalog, inspired by the 10 Commandments, made for Polish television in the late 80s. And of course, so this, if we're going strictly per commandment, this would be, thou shalt not take the name of thy Lord. Anyway, I know what it is, but it's trying to get the syntax. It's interesting to kind of start getting a sense of the series as a whole, having only discussed one part before. The way that this series was produced is pretty interesting. So Kieślowski filmed and edited the 10 parts, including the 2 feature-length versions of 5 and 6, in 21 months. And he was concerned about getting bored with this long period of shooting.
Sure.
And apparently he didn't enjoy it. He found directing pretty boring, like being on set and directing.
Right.
So he chose 9 different cinematographers for the 10 films in order not to be bored. And he also wanted each film to have a unique look. And he made a point of not giving them much direction as to the look of the film, and he didn't even look through the camera to see what the frame was going to be or anything like that. He just kind of left it to the cinematographers. But he pointed out afterwards that, strangely, they all ended up with a pretty similar look, with the exception of number 5 because of the weird filters and stuff. So yeah, it's kind of interesting to how that kind of converged. I know that at least some of the DPs were observing the work of the others, because Kieślowski would shoot part of one film in the morning in one location and then go and do another one in the afternoon and another one in the evening. So it was all kind of jumbled up together. So the cinematographers were probably some of them were probably hanging out, and seeing what the other guys were doing.
Sure. Yeah, I imagine that would do a lot to inform the choices that each is making with reference to the others.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that what I recall of these films when I watched them for the first time over a decade ago is that they all do look pretty similar, with the exception of that one. I wonder to what extent their shared visual palette, we'll say, has to do with the environment in which it's being shot. Specifically in the case of these 2 films, the apartment complex that the stories are centered around. So, our listeners will remember that from the first film, we're dealing with a father and a son who live in this apartment complex. Well, for the second installment, we're back to the same complex of apartment buildings. and they're built in, this characteristic Eastern Bloc, dismal Soviet fashion. And, I think you could characterize this architecture as dictatorial. It has a message. It kind of dictates the way in which it can be sort of received and interpreted. I think it's specifically dehumanizing. And so at the same time as being an interesting locale for the setting of these very human stories, I wonder to what extent it also kind of dictates or determines the aesthetic feel.
Right.
I mean, obviously, I'm not saying that different photographers can't shoot the same space in very different ways. But I think that in the case of these two films, at least, the apartment buildings cast a certain light over what takes place within.
Yeah, and it is interesting that makes it all the more interesting when, at the beginning of this film, we see the kind of like distinctive greenhouse windows that one of our protagonists has.
Right, exactly.
And also it makes it more interesting to see some of the interiors of these apartments. Some of them are more slick and modern looking than others.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a pretty big contrast between, for example, the doctor's apartment and Dorota's apartment in this.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So let's talk about that first scene, because at the opening of this film, the camera pans up the side of the building and you see these balconies for each of the apartments on each level. And you see this sort of repetition, this drabness, this brutalist style. When we get to the doctor's balcony, we see, as you've already pointed out, that he's built this sort of greenhouse enclosure that distinguishes his balcony from the others. And then we cut into the green room. We see him tending to this sort of lackluster cactus that he's trying to get to grow. We see that he has a lot of other plants. As he exits the greenhouse room, it's not a green room, but it is a greenhouse. A green room being like where the musicians sit. Why are you not responding to me, Thomas?
I'm just waiting for this to be over.
What?
I'm waiting for this green room segue this green room diversion to be over.
And I think that there's something about his character that's conveyed to us right away when we see that he's growing plants, and he has this bird, even though he doesn't have a family, at least not as far as we can tell from the outset. There is like a real sense in which this guy is a father figure tending to these living things.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. It's interesting in contrast to the plant in the other main character, Dorota's apartment.
Right.
Because I wish I could remember what it's connected with in the film. It might be pretty early on.
Yeah.
It might be. I think it's before she visits her husband in the hospital the first time. She's like twisting the leaves off one by one.
Yeah.
And then she kind of twists the stem.
Ugh.
So it's just interesting. She has this very healthy plant that she's like destroying.
Yeah.
But then later, I kind of wonder, because she brings the leaves and leaves them in her husband's otherwise very drab room. So I kind of wonder if that was her intention in the first place.
I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
No, yeah. I mean, so if you look at that scene, and that I thought was like one of the most brutal pieces of filmmaking I think I've ever seen. Really, I had like such a visceral response to watching that moment.
Watching her, she kind of methodically, slowly just
destroys
takes off
this
every
plant.
leaf.
Yeah, and I think part of what made it so brutal was that this is a real plant. That I am in fact seeing a human being destroying this living thing.
Right.
And of course, too, it has to do with her performance. She really charges her performance with a lot that's going on underneath the surface. And this scene is no exception.
The end tail of that is my favorite, in a purely visual sense, my favorite shot of the film, where she is twisting the stem after she's taken off all the leaves, and then she kind of like comes to herself and like lets it go.
Yeah.
And then it's the stem by itself, just like as plant stems do, just kind of slowly like moving and righting itself. It's this very like visually striking.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I think when we watched it together, you pointed out that it looked like the arm of a clock ticking.
Actually, that's even more interesting now, because I wasn't thinking about this. But in the thick booklet that comes with the Criterion release of these films, there's some essays by this film scholar. I think his name is Paul Coates, and he's got these mini essays for each film. And the second one, well, he mentions a couple of things to do with the passage of time and characters kind of interacting or seeking to control the passage of time in various ways. Mm-hmm. One of them, the major one, is how when he's telling this story to his housekeeper, the doctor breaks it up into little episodes.
It's interesting.
As he's leading up to this story of this culmination of this tragedy in his life. Mm-hmm. He's parceling it out in as small chunks as possible. Mm. And then Paul Coates also mentions that scene where she's methodically taking the leaves off. I forget why he said it has to do with time, but it's just I guess it's the slow, methodical way in which she does it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's interesting that visually, I thought that plant kind of looked like a clock moving as well.
Yeah, well,
and it looked like a clock moving backwards.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because this is the second time actually that we would have seen the imagery of a ticking clock. So if you'll remember when the doctor is filling up his bath, there's a moment where he suffers some sort of a heart attack or something. He stops all of a sudden and he goes down to the side of the tub. There's a shot of his hand gripping the side of the tub, and you can see his watch. And
oh yeah, I guess I missed that maybe.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's framed. It's right in the center of the frame, so I think it is something that our attention is being drawn to.
Yeah.
And I don't know exactly what's going on in that moment, but I think it suggests this guy's impending mortality.
Well, there's a lot of these things, and there's an echo of. I mean, the situation is that this woman. Just to step back for a moment, the situation of the film is basically this woman's husband is dying. She's never been able to have children with him. She's now 3 months pregnant with a baby that's not his, and she's decided that if he survives, she has to abort the baby, and if he dies, then she can have the baby. Yeah. But she's trying to get the doctor to tell her what's going to happen to her husband so that she can make this decision. And this ties into what I'm about to say. So there's a parallel to the plant, her slow, methodical destruction of the plant, and her slowly. One of the more iconic shots probably from the series is her slowly pushing this glass of tea or whatever it is off the table until it shatters, and she does it in such a very deliberate, fatalistic kind of way, and then she has a little smile after it falls off. Yeah. But it ties into what I see as I'm not sure that she actually makes a choice in the film, or she acts like she doesn't have a choice.
Well,
in other words, she sets up this situation where if this happens, then I have to do this.
Right.
And if that happens, then I have to do that. And the doctor is the one in control.
Well, so
the doctor's the one who really exercises of course they're both making choices, but he's the one who's exercising agency. And so when she does these little kind of fatalist, these little methodical, slow things where there's especially in the case of the glass, where she's she's waiting for something to happen essentially.
Yeah.
But she's doing it, but she's waiting for it to happen also.
What you're interpreting as fatalist, I would say, is in fact her asserting control over things. I think that the impulse to abort her child is precisely this, that something has happened in her life that has interrupted her life, that has penetrated, has shot through and changed the game. She can no longer go on loving these two people, as she says, as if they don't kind of overlap.
Right.
This child disrupts this sort of pretty mechanism that she's arranged everything for herself. Right. So
but I think she thinks it's her circumstances that are dictating. She wants to tell herself that it's her circumstances that are dictating her actions. But as in the glass thing,
I see, Thomas, I don't think so. I think that she doesn't even recognize the degree to which she's forfeiting her freedom. I think she thinks that she is grasping at a semblance of control when she says, well, if this happens, then I'll do this. And if this happens, then I'll do that. She's hedging her bets, right? What's the only reason why she wouldn't want to keep this child if her husband lives? Because she can't live with the knowledge that this man whom she loves is going to think that this is his son, who it's not, you know?
Yeah.
So she's asserting control in that.
Interesting.
And when she destroys things and derives satisfaction, there's an imposing of my will on things.
Right. I think you're right. That is what she's doing. But I also think that like she's set it up so that she can say, well, like, this is the consequence. This choice is the consequence. Like, this is my only option.
Well, I know,
in this
and
case,
that's what I'm saying is ironic. I think it's ironic that someone who is chasing after control, who is so like disrupted by the fact that something that she can't control has happened in her life. Not to mention her husband's condition. She goes to the doctor and she says, you must, and I have to know. And the doctor says, the only thing I must do is do the best for your husband that I can.
Right.
You know, and he keeps telling her that it looks bad, but he's seen people rebound from worse, and he's seen people die from much less. And she finds it so repugnant that she can't get a straight answer. So this is, again, like her trying to assert control. But it's ironic that for someone who's so desperate to control things and control the people around her, she's forfeiting so much of her choice by saying, well, if this happens, then I'll do this. If that happens, then I'll do that. And I think that this is actually characteristic of people who are over anxious about controlling the things in their lives. I think that they're paralyzed when their freedom is really solicited. You know, when her lover is calling her and she's screening his phone calls and just listening to the voice message go, you know, like you get the sense that she's paralyzed by the choice that's being asked of her.
Yeah. Well, I agree with everything you've said. It's just that the scene where she pushes the glass off the table, the slow and deliberate way in which she does it and kind of like contemplating it, it suggests to me both that she's doing something, she is controlling something, and that she's also like watching something happen because of like the way in which she regards this, you know? And also like more than with the plant, because there's this moment, it's this gradual process, and then something happens all at once when the glass is pushed off the table. It also suggests to me that she's like kind of like waiting for a definitive change in her situation, or like waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like she wants to know what's going to happen to her husband, because that's going to be like the defining moment for her. So it suggests all these different things to me at once. And yeah, I agree. It is very ironic, and she is seeking control.
Because she tries to control the doctor throughout the film as well.
Yeah.
You know, like, so, you know, take for instance, like her offer to give him a ride, and he says no, he deflects. You know, it's a false generosity. It's like a false piety. In fact, I think about her in terms of kind of how we find ourselves interacting with God. So basically setting conditions for God. I look at the doctor as a kind of image of God the Father. Now, I've already pointed to how he's introduced with the greenhouse and the birds, almost like, you know, God creating in Genesis. But he's also never given a name in this film. Yeah. So anytime a character, especially a central character, isn't named, I take that as a signal that perhaps this character is supposed to be operating on a level that goes beyond their personality. And there's plenty about this character that's very rich in personality. He's not like a blank slate. But, you know, he's a doctor. We've come to find that he's had a family and has lost them rather tragically. But in the first scene, when we're introduced to Dorota, she's standing out in the hallway, looking out the window on the floor where he lives, which is not the floor that she lives on. And he sort of notices this, but doesn't think much of it. He notices this a second time and perhaps thinks a little more of it when he comes back from work that day and she's still standing there. She wants to talk to him, but she lacks the courage to do so. Right. So she didn't say anything to him in the morning when he was leaving for work. She doesn't say anything to him in the evening when he comes back. He goes into his apartment and she comes and stands in front of his doorway. He can hear the footsteps, but she doesn't knock.
That's great.
And he, in fact, comes to the door quietly and opens it all of a sudden, sort of catching her unawares. And even then, she still doesn't say anything. He's the one who initiates contact, so to speak. He says, something I can do for you.
Right.
And then she says, yes. And then he says, I'm listening. You know, and I think that this is so typical of how we interact with God. Almost like we're so slow to go to him with our requests. And he really makes himself available and has to kind of take the initiative to let us know he's listening.
Yeah.
But then, you know, just as soon as we start to actually speak to God is when we start to make all these assumptions and start setting all these sort of criteria and these demands on how he's going to interact with us and how we're going to respond in return. And I think that it's this sort of self-centeredness, this arrogance, this assertion of control that characterizes her relationship with the doctor throughout the film, her relationship to her husband and to her lover, and it's ultimately characterizing her relationship to her child.
Right.
And this is where things sort of come to a head. And what I think is so eloquent about this scene that we've been talking about with the plant, where she's methodically destroying it, she's twisting the stem, but she stops short, right? She could do this sort of like final, just break the stem, but she stops.
Yeah.
And the thing starts to sort of straighten back out. There's a sense in which that this plant is still alive, that it can still come back.
When she pushes the glass over, is it after she's made the decision to abort the baby?
Well, I mean, I think it's arguable. I think to what extent she's actually decided to abort the baby or not is debatable.
Or after she says she's decided. That's what I'm wondering, because there is a difference between the ending of those two scenes, right? And what you've pointed out there.
Yeah, well, I mean, like at the end of the day, she, in the same way that she stopped short of killing this plant, she does stop short of killing this child.
Right.
And I think that sort of what exists at the center of this story, this parable, is what you've already mentioned, is agency. You know, to what extent her choice actually operates in that. And I don't know that it's as simple as saying, well, it doesn't, and it's just him, that he's the doctor is the one who decides.
Yeah, no, outcome. She's making choices, but like, I guess what I see is that like her choices seem to have already been made before the film begins, almost in how she chooses to look at the situation.
Yeah.
But what you were saying about the doctor as like a figure of God the Father and her desire to be in control and to control God kind of like, I don't know, reinforces what I was thinking, actually, because, you know, it's kind of like an insight of the Catholic faith that like when we seek to know the future, we're seeking to control the future in a sense.
Right.
And yet, like, the whole like pretense of divination is that you're just trying to find out what's going to happen. Is that you're seeing yourself as a slave to fate, but you're actually seeking control. So to me, like the two go together in like an ironic, paradoxical way.
Yes,
it's like because the people, you know, the Roman emperors who decided, you know, whether to fight a battle based on the entrails of a goose or whatever, they were acting like it's just in the hands of somebody else, or it's like it's about fate or whatever, but they're making choices the whole way through and they're seeking to be in control. So obviously what they're doing is actually trying to be in control, but I see it as going along with this idea of like this pretense that I'm not in control.
Right.
That these are the predetermined,
fair enough,
forks in the road kind of thing.
And I guess that's sort of where our disagreement is that I see it operating as well, but in a subconscious way, that it's not ever rising to the level of like consciousness, that she's actually acknowledging that she doesn't have
I see what
choice,
you're saying.
You know?
So you don't see it as she's pretending that she doesn't have a choice.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess the only thing is that like it's so important to her that she know what's going to happen, as it is for anybody who's trying to control a situation, right? You know. And demanding that she gets a response. Well, I guess, yeah. So what you're saying is more that like she wants to know what's going to happen so that she can make a choice and control the situation either way. Yes. The way that I initially saw it was more like of course that is what she's doing, but that the way she's framing it is that like, well, this is what I have to do in this situation, and this is what I have to do in that situation. But I think I get what you're saying now, that it's more like she's consciously. I think the reason it seemed that way to me is that we never see her actually like consider an alternative, sort of like at least explicitly in dialogue in the film to the consequences of either situation.
Right.
It's like something that has been decided by her, at least, before the film begins.
Yeah.
And then we see the doctor really exercising freedom obviously they both are exercising free will, but he's the one who makes a free choice, in determining what's going to happen, essentially.
Yeah. I mean, because so I guess you're referring to this sort of climactic moment when she sort of lays down this ultimatum. I'm going to have this abortion today. Tell me.
Yeah.
And he says, don't do it. Your husband's going to die. And I think we have reason to think that his freedom is operating there, because we've been shown another scene where it's clear that he's not quite sure how to read the data. They're looking at the blood under the microscope, and he asks one of his assistants one of his students, another doctor, to come and take a look, and he asks him what he thinks. And the younger doctor, looking through the microscope, begins to say, well, you always taught us. And he says, well, forget what I taught you. What do you think? Mm-hmm. And he says, progression. But we can see in the doctor's face, the older doctor, that this is sort of an unsatisfying response. So it would seem to be that in that scene, we are being signaled that the doctor's not entirely sure that it's one way or the other. And so when he tells her he's going to die, don't do it, it's reasonable for us to think that he's saying this less because of the conclusiveness of the data and more because of his investment in the life of this child.
Yeah.
And that one read of this moment is that he's taking the Lord's name in vain by doing so, because, well, she asks him to swear to it. And I don't know the Polish, whether she specifically says swear to God or not.
Yeah.
But I think that just in the notion of swearing or taking an oath on anything is sort of implicit, this swearing against God or against the truth, the order of things, that anytime you swear, you take your name or the Lord's name in your hands, and to do so in vain is forbidden. So, I mean, I don't know. Do you think he lies in that moment?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if he had like done mental reservations such that it's like, we're all going to die someday kind of thing. But she asked him specifically about like this situation, this disease, what you're saying there. I mean, it's a good time to mention that Kieślowski saw the way these films interacted with the Ten Commandments is that he was turning each commandment into a challenge for a concrete person in a concrete situation, and asking the question, is it possible to live by these commandments? He's not questioning whether they're valid. He's not advocating moral relativism, he said, but he was asking, has the situation for modern man become so complicated that following them is impossible? And of course, like, this may or may not be a disingenuous question, because I think of forces in the church today that sometimes, instead of saying, well, this moral teaching is wrong, they'll say, well, we have to acknowledge all the complexities in the case such that in practice it's actually impossible to fulfill. We see this with the divorce and remarriage debate. So this is interesting because he sets up a situation in which a life is saved in the film on the second commandment, if we want to put it so simply. A life is saved by somebody taking God's name in vain. Now, is this Kieślowski kind of like saying there's an inherent contradiction here, or like it's actually impossible to live by the commandments and do the right thing simultaneously all the time? On the other hand, he says that following the commandments is doing the right thing, but it's just a question of whether or not people are going to do it. Or is it more of like a situation of like taking people's motives into account and kind of like a merciful approach? I guess one of the reasons I'm asking is there's another comment he made. Integrity is an extremely complicated combination, and we can never ultimately say I was honest or I wasn't honest. In all our actions, we find ourselves in a position from which there's really no way out. And even if there is, it's not a better way, but only the lesser evil. The choosing of which way out to take, of course, defines integrity. So obviously we don't agree with this as Catholics, but he said in multiple places that he thought basically most of our choices were only choosing between like two evils, basically.
Well, I mean, I think that, okay, so that's obviously, a really dark, pessimistic way of looking at the moral life. I don't think that that's necessarily on display in these two films that we've seen so far. It could be this sort of imperfect way of reaching for something like the virtue of prudence and trying to articulate, what is the prudential judgment that comes into our moral decisions in applying these commandments. And so I very much see this film in particular as a film about prudence. I think that the doctor exemplifies prudence in his relationship with Dorota throughout the film, when she's clearly being disingenuous. She's clearly sort of like saying things on false pretenses.
Right.
Like when she tells him, I just want to do all I can for my husband. It's like, okay, yeah, right. Like your concerns are somewhere else. He puts up necessary boundaries in his relationship with her, but he also knows when to relax those in making exceptions for her to come visit, for her to come speak with him. He even exercises a lot of hospitality and generosity in letting her into his home. And I also think that he's savvy in the way he speaks to her, because he does exercise some reserve. When she asks him, when she tells him that she loves two people, and she asks him, do you know that it's possible to love two people? He's silent. And then she answers for herself. She says, well, it is. But at the end of the film, when the husband who's now alive, who has recovered, comes to him and says, do you know what it means to have a child? He answers him, says, yes, I do.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this question is sort of recapitulated. In one instance, he holds back. And in fact, he turns, when she comes to his apartment, before he lets her in, he turns the photo of his deceased wife and children around to face the wall. He sort of shields this part of himself from her.
Yeah.
But with the husband, he doesn't.
Yeah, and I think that's a great observation. And also, we see that he has the same impulses with regard to controlling things as she does, but he's able to let go of those in certain moments. So Paul Coates in his essay mentions specifically, one of the parts of like controlling the flow of time, not just the way he tells the story about his family, but also the way that he's setting these hours. And he's like, no, you come back in 2 days. But then he relaxes it and lets her come. So we see him, despite the fact that she's a young woman and he is an old man, he's the one who's able to like shift his behavior and like change his approach when he sees that it's called for.
Yeah.
But, I do think like, maybe just saying a falsehood in this situation to save a life would be one thing. There's obviously the classic moral debate over whether saying a falsehood always is a lie and all that. But, swearing by God's name, if that's what he does, to a falsehood would be another matter. And I could see an argument that this is a reflection of Kieślowski's pessimistic, practical morals. But it could also be Kieślowski raising the question,
Yeah, well, and I think that perhaps another way of looking at this is that a corollary to the second commandment of thou shalt not take the Lord thy God's name in vain is thou shalt not put the Lord thy God to the test. That actually the second commandment is kind of operating for Dorota in the breach, as much as it is for the doctor in her sort of insistence on knowing and this consequentialist attitude that she's taking to the set of events that are before her, that she's putting God to the test. Yes. She's putting the doctor to the test. Absolutely. That he's not beholden to Like, who is she to ask him to swear to God? When, in fact, she's already asked him, do you believe in God? And he says, well, yes. I forget his wording exactly, but he says, a God who's probably only big enough for me. And she says, a private God? Well, ask him for absolution. I don't know. What do you make of that interaction when she asks him about God?
Well, what do you make of his answer? I think that's the maybe it would be easier to know what to make of her question when we know what to make of his answer.
I'm not sure.
What does he mean, a God that's only big enough for me? And what does she mean when she asks him to pray for your God for absolution? Is she asking her to pray for absolution for her?
I don't think so. Well, yeah, maybe. I don't know. She'd always been so cold with him throughout the film that and she was always putting him down at every turn. I initially interpreted it as you should be asking absolution because you're being such a stick in the mud. And he does seem kind of like shamed by her response. But I don't know. She may be asking for absolution for herself.
I'm really not sure what to make of that. When people say things like that, I just ignore them. You know what I mean? Because God that's only big enough for me. Like, you hear a lot of stupid comments from modern people about God, stupid things that agnostics say or whatever.
Yeah.
So these are two great performances.
Yeah, that's right.
By two of Poland's most prominent actors.
I was wondering about that because when I was watching this, I specifically thought, I wonder who these people are in Polish culture, the Doctor and Dorota, because they're powerhouse performances.
Krystyna Yanda plays Dorota, and Alexander Bardini plays the Doctor. Bardini also appeared in a number of Kieślowski's other films, Three Colors White, The Double Life of Veronique, and No End, which I think might have been the first film that he and Pisevich made together. So yeah, it's great performances there.
In particular is the two monologues that the Doctor has when he's telling the story of how his family dies the day that his family's his wife and his children were killed at their home when it was bombed during the war. And we see him telling this story to his housekeeper first at the beginning of the film and then again later toward the end. But the first instance, it operates by way of a introduction of the character to us. We haven't really seen him speak or interact much before this. And we also don't really know what the story is or where it's going. He leaves it off with a kind of cliffhanger, to be continued. But it's clear in his delivery, the actor's delivery of this text, that there's so much that's going on underneath the surface, even though he doesn't show it so much in his facial expressions or his manner of speaking. It's a pretty staid, sort of muted performance, but there's a lot that's living underneath the surface and being conveyed in the eyes. And I think that the same can be said for the actress who plays Dorota, that she sends all these mixed signals and she tries to put on this mask, but we really get the sense that there's this inner turmoil, this real conflict that's going on between the forces of good and evil in her heart.
Yeah.
When that scene of the bee crawling out of the sugary,
it's like a
jam.
Yeah, strawberries.
I think, that's obviously supposed to operate as like a visual metaphor for the miraculous recovery of the husband.
Also, the fact that the husband was saying the world had appeared, I forget what he says exactly, but basically the world in his sickness had begun to appear so degraded and disgusting that death almost would have been welcome. And that also, to me, I see the brightest color we see in the film, these strawberries, these red gooey strawberries, is representing the temptation of just settling into death, and this fly it's
a bee, I think.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, bee.
Yeah. Well, I saw that as much of a metaphor mirroring what's gone on with Dorota in coming so close to killing her own child. Well, that there's this redemption that happens at the end.
Right.
She escapes the snare.
Right.
The last time we see Dorota, we see her performing with the Philharmonic, and she's playing the violin, and she looks up, and I don't think I was imagining it, but I feel like you can definitely see there's like a look of recognition in her eyes, like she sees someone.
She sees the doctor.
How do you know?
I don't think he's actually shown.
No, he's not shown.
Okay.
He's not shown. So there's the question. Yeah.
Right.
But her response, her smile, it could just as well be that she's seeing her lover, who's also a musician who does these concert circuits, you know?
Right.
But I choose to think that she is seeing the doctor, and that the smile is, it indicates that a kind of conversion has taken place.
Yeah.
You know?
The image of there's a lot of more images of like slow time passing moments.
The water
and
dripping.
They all, most of them have to do with decay. I mean, like if you look at the ones we talked about with Dorota, it's decay.
Yeah.
You know, with the doctor's story, it's the end of his family. You know, it's her husband's gradual death. The paint dripping and peeling, and the peeling walls in the patient's room that he's kind of looking at out of, you know, barely open eyes. And the one that isn't, it's kind of a bizarre, grotesque image, is the one of the bee crawling and escaping from the strawberry, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Jammy, juicy strawberry thing. And there's stewed strawberries. That's right. And it is kind of a bizarre image, but that's the only one that is like heading in a positive direction. And yet it is this strange, but you find yourself rooting for this bee once you kind of realize what's going on, because it could just, we've seen scenes like this in movies. It could just as well be a thing where a insect is used as a sign of decay. In other words, like there's some nice fruit and then like an insect lands on it. It's like, ooh, that's gross. But in this case, the fruit is like the death, right? And like the insect is escaping from this.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's high drama in that shot. And that's one of the things that I think distinguishes it from the first installment that we've seen in this series, is that I thought that this one had more visually striking imagery that it employed. My response to her plucking the plant and my response to the drama of this bee escaping the stewed strawberry juice was similarly visceral.
Krzysztof Kieślowski, who conceptualized the whole series and co-wrote it with Kieślowski, there's a special feature on the Criterion Blu-ray where he's kind of like it goes through each of the 10 films and he like says like kind of like what question they were asking in relation to a commandment. For this one, he said, "Are there relationships that are so damaged that it's impossible to find a resolution? This film says there are no such situations. The glass of juice was the way of showing that something fundamental had changed. This glass says not to take the name of God in vain because you don't know what solution there might be." So in terms of taking the name of God in vain, I think that what he is thinking about, there's a number of ways you could consider it, like her demanding to know the future, what the doctor does. But what Kieślowski points to is presuming to know that there's no solution.
Yeah.
No good solution to a problem.
Yeah.
Which is kind of like, in a way, like in a sense, like different from what Kieślowski said that I quoted earlier.
Yeah.
And Kieślowski is the Catholic half of the pair.
Right.
So
going off of that, I think we can touch on this strain that runs through this film about it's set up at the beginning when the doctor is telling his story about the day that his family dies, and his son his son was getting a tooth, his first tooth, and his father had come over
and lost a tooth.
And, you know, it literally evokes a tooth for a tooth. He says everything tallies. But this is also kind of how Dorota is behaving, as if like, well, if my husband dies, this child will live. But if husband lives, my child will die. You know, there's this sort of representation of this same kind of idea of everything tallying. But it's confounded at the end, or it's not actually, because the doctor who lost his family in the war, now is in a position to give another man back his family.
Right.
And I think that this links up too with the imagery of the plant that she's destroyed. She destroys the plant, but then she brings the leaves to her husband. You know, she's broken his trust, but she brings this child to him and all things are made new.
Yeah, there's another little cryptic comment there when the doctor is telling the story before he leaves his family and their house is destroyed by, I guess, a bomb or something.
Yeah.
His wife says, like, I don't like this. There are too many teeth.
Too many teeth.
Be careful. I'm not sure what that even means.
Yeah,
but
I don't know either.
There's a nice little callback at the end of this film to the first film, I think, thematically, where the doctor says to the husband, don't thank me, basically like, it's just another reminder that, like,
it's not X-rays we're treating.
It's not X-rays we're treating. It's implicitly, it's people. So that kind of like reminds me of the whole theme of the first film with the computer and the calculation of the ice.
I do think that, like, what distinguishes the ending of this film from the ending of the first one is that whereas in the first one, we have a terrible, tragic circumstance and this sort of these rays of beauty shining forth out of it. I think in this one, the second one, we have what is by all accounts a really beautiful, miraculous circumstance, the life of this child being spared and this husband recovering. But we have sort of the if I can call them like rays of darkness, the brokenness is still so apparent, that this has kind of come about in a very fallen world among very fallen people.
And children, it's been observed, children or the absence of children are like a very big part of this series as a whole. Mm-hmm. So we'll be continuing to talk about that, I'm sure. I also like the husband, it's kind of like, aside from the fact that you're happy that he's recovered, you're also happy that the actor like gets to do something besides like lie in bed and like have his eyes mostly closed.
You said you looked up this actor.
So this guy, he's got quite a name.
You don't bother.
Olgierd something. He was in 3 different productions about John Paul II. He played John Paul II's father in a miniseries about him. He voice acted John Paul II in some other biopic thing. And he also voice acted the Polish Cardinal Adam Sapieha in another miniseries about John Paul II. I guess there have been understandably, a lot of Polish movies and miniseries about John Paul II.
Yeah.
So I just thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, that is cool.
I'm betting you could find a lot of, like throw a rock at a Polish actor of a certain generation and they had been in a production about John Paul II.
Maybe.
Whether they were Catholic or not. You know what? I kind of want to see the 2009 Bengali feature film adaptation of this, Duando, which exists. My gut tells me that it's going to be like really broad and miss the point and just be funny, Yeah,
well, maybe we can do a bonus episode after all this. We've gone through all the Dekalog installments.
I would love to see Duando.
Yeah. Well, so what's the next film we're watching? Is it about Pope John Paul II?
Ugh, that bombed. So our next film will be our first silent film that we've done. There are, I think, 4, well, maybe more like 5 or 6 silent films on the list. This is the very earliest film on the list, all the way back to 1903. This film was 92 years old when this list came out.
It is The Passion of Our Lord Jesus Christ, but in French. So, La Passion de Notre Seigneur. I don't know how to say Jesus Christ.
We'll put the name of, we'll spell French. That out for you in the show notes so that you can look for that up, because that actually, we're in luck with this one being so old and in the public domain. It's on YouTube. It's about 44 minutes long, I think. This is one of the earliest really artistically significant films about Jesus. So we're looking forward to checking that out. I'm looking forward to doing a silent film. It'll be a whole different kind of conversation, probably.
Yeah.
So
maybe
that'll
we can
be
just
fun.
do a silent episode.
I mean, look, it's 117 years old, this film.
Wow.
Which is pretty remarkable.
That is remarkable.
It's a lot of the movies we were watching are like 70 or 80 years old, which is already pretty like crazy to think about. But yeah, a full 117 years ago.
Yeah.
This film was made.
We're watching ghosts.